On the third night at sea, Lisa and Jim had the 10 to 2 watch, with Neil awake in the wheelhouse. Near midnight, Jean fixed them some hot tea, one bag for 3 cups. Vagabond was still sailing due south with a good easterly breeze. An afternoon squall line seemed well behind them. With Jim now at the helm and Lisa watching the trawling rig in the side cockpit, Neil and Jean sat kitty-corner across from each other a few feet apart in the unlit wheelhouse, sipping at their weak tea. "Do you think about where we're going to end up?" Jean asked him unexpectedly. Neil did think about it, frequently. It made for depressing thinking. "Yes," he answered. "Will we be able to settle in Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands?" Jean asked, after she saw that he wasn't going to go on. "Perhaps," Neil replied, doubting it very much. As he looked at her, he wished he could share his fears, but he wanted even more to spare her the burden. Even though the sky was mostly overcast, the nearly full moon shed light on Vagabond's decks and allowed Neil to see the outline of Jean's face and body. She was very still, her teacup held in her lap. The afternoon squalls had dampened the seas, and for a change, Vagabond wasn't pounding, but rolling gently through the water. "I suppose, ultimately, it has to be South America, doesn't it?" she went on. "Some place untouched, where the infrastructure of civilization is still solid." Neil sipped at his tea. He'd heard a report that half a dozen South American countries had set up internment camps for the American refugees. The threat of the mysterious plague-like disease that was spreading from the western USA was increasing their fear and resentment of Americans. "Yes, I guess it will," he said without elaborating. "That was a strange time we had the other night, wasn't it?" she asked him unexpectedly in a low, intense voice. Neil suddenly realised that Jim at the helm, 8 feet away, and Lisa were both within earshot. That other night, in the side cockpit, had been, my God, almost a week before. "It was more than that," Neil answered. For half a minute, as Neil stared at Jean's indistinct face, neither of them spoke. "There aren't any rules anymore, are there?" she said after a while. "We have to create our own." "There are rules," Neil said. "Blowing up the world didn't get rid of them. I mean, some of the old ones can't be applied anymore." "Like what?" Neil wondered. "Like widows in a period of mourning? Love leading to marriage? Love leading to bed? Like what?" he asked. He noticed Lisa coming in from the port cockpit to talk to Jim. "The old rule that you could go to bed with a man for enjoyment," Jean said in a low voice. Startled, he waited for her to go on. It wasn't an old rule he had expected her to come up with. "In the new world," she continued softly, glancing towards the wheel where Jim and Lisa were also talking in low voices, "in our new world, in this small world of Vagabond, that rule won't work. My sleeping with a man would transform our universe." "Yes, it would," Neil said. "Frank wants me to sleep with him," she announced. "I see," he said in a voice so low he wasn't sure if she could hear it, then louder. "Rather popular, aren't you?" For a moment the only sound was the water rushing past Vagabond's 3 hulls. In the darkness Jean was only a vague silhouette. "Neil." The sound of anguish in her soft voice made Neil move to the edge of his seat, and leaning towards her he started to speak, but he knew that even whispers would be overheard by Jim and Lisa. He slowly lifted his right hand in the darkness to touch her unseen face. When it reached her cheek, she held it against her face with both hands, turning to kiss his palm. "I see," said Neil in a normal voice. "I hope you see," she answered in a low voice, but still loud enough that Jim and Lisa could hear. "What I see," Neil said slowly, caressing her face with his hand, and fully aware of the absurdity of the conversation, "is that you are still temporarily insane. Am I correct?" "Yes," she said softly. "And you see that I am still temporarily insane, correct?" "Oh, yes, I hope so, yes." "Now you're telling me," he went on in a low voice, barely able to contain his joy and laughter, "that Frank has temporarily become insane too. Is that right?" "Yes," she giggled softly. "How about Jim? Is he insane?" She laughed again. "I don't think so," she said. "Well, I think so," said Jim suddenly from the wheel. "I can't tell what you two are talking about. You sound nuts." "Mother, you're being silly," Lisa added with a childlike primness that Jean thought she'd lost since the war began. As Neil and Jean stopped laughing, Neil could feel Jean tense, her hand still gripping his. "Oh, Lisa," she said, "you missed it all. We were joking about the insanity of trying to create a new world in South America, but that's where all of us, Frank too, think we have to end up." "Not me," said Jim. "I think we should head for the South Pacific." "See," said Neil, grinning in the darkness. "You were right, Jean. Jim at least is still sane." "Thank God," said Jean. "Right," said Neil. "Around Cape Horn," said Jim, and Neil and Jean's laughter burst into the wheelhouse again, Jim and Lisa turning to stare at them in slight bewilderment. "Christ, how do you expect me to sleep?" Frank's voice cut into Neil's giddy world like an executioner's sword. Pulling away from Jean, he turned to see Frank's gaunt body outlined in the entranceway behind him. "I'm sorry, Frank," Neil said quickly. "We got a little silly, I guess." "You sure as hell did," Frank said, still looming at the entrance 10 feet away. "You sound like a couple of loonies out here." Jean stood up. "It was thoughtless of us," she said. "Forgive us, Frank." She walked over to him and put her arms around him. Neil saw him respond stiffly at first, and then put his arms around her and lower his head to rest on hers. "You make it kind of tough to hold a grudge," he said. "I hope so," she said softly. "What were you doing anyway?" he asked. There was a brief silence. "Flirting with Neil," she answered. "I'm trying to get out of evening garbage detail." "Try flirting with me," Frank said. "I own the damn boat." Jean stretched up and kissed Frank on the cheek. "Good night again," she whispered, and moved off towards the cabin. "You might pay a little attention to the boat," Frank said to Neil, "every now and then, for appearances." "I pay attention to this boat every second of every day, and you know it," he snapped back. Jean had stopped at her cabin entrance, and Jim and Lisa, who had withdrawn from all of this, were still standing at the wheel. "Yeah," Frank said with a strained silence. "I guess you're right. I'm sorry, Neil." Neil waited a moment before responding. "Don't worry about it," Neil said. "I'm sorry about the noise." "Yay. Good night. Good night, Jim. You too, Lisa." Frank moved away again to his cabin, sliding his hatch closed behind him. Neil walked over to where Jean was still standing at her cabin entranceway. "I'm sorry," he said to her softly. She looked up in the darkness and then away. "I think I love you, Neil," she said in a low voice, "but it's no good. We're a family. Our love would be a kind of incest." "You're not my sister," he replied, almost sharply. "Ah, but I am," she said softly, looking up at him. "Don't you see? You and Frank are brothers, and Frank and I are brother and sister, so we're all too close, Neil." "I see that Frank would be hurt if we made love," he said after a pause, "and I don't want to hurt him, but he'll be hurt by our love whether we act on it or not." She turned away, a face barely visible in the dark, and glanced towards Jim and Lisa. "In this world, in our new world, one must be alone," she said. "Does that mean no two can ever be together?" he asked, pulling her gently against him. She turned to look at him, and then turned away. "Oh, Neil, I don't know," she whispered. "I've got to get things right with Frank. You must see that." He stared down at her barely visible face. "I'm not sure that's possible, Jean," he suggested quietly. He tried to lift her head to look at her as she pressed her face against his shoulder, refusing to budge. He could feel the wetness of tears on his bare shoulder. He held her, stroking her hair against his back. Her smile faded, and he suddenly had a clear image of himself on a ship racing through the night away from a universe of death to the north. A second image of Frank angrily looming up in the wheelhouse entrance returned to him, and he felt a great sadness. "It's no use, Neil," Jim whispered finally. "We're not free." In the wheelhouse, after Neil and Jean had gone off their separate cabins, Jim and Lisa carried on with the task of keeping Vagabond on course. For many minutes neither of them spoke. Lisa left Jim to check on the trawling rig and spent 2 minutes reeling in the lure to look for seaweed. She cleaned off the lure and set it back out again, adjusting the drag. When she returned to Jim at the helm, they were both silent. They didn't touch each other. A muffled sobbing from Jean's cabin cut through the silence, and both of them stiffened. After another minute in which every groan of a line stretching, every slap of a halyard, rustle of a sail, whine of the wind in the rigging, seemed for a brief second to be the sound of a woman moaning, Jim finally spoke. "Are you all right, Lisa?" he asked quietly, touching her briefly on the shoulder, and then letting his arm fall. "It's so sad," she said in a small voice. "It's hard on my father too," Jim replied. "I know," she said. "Everyone seems so alone," said Jim. "It makes me feel lonely." He had to put both hands on the wheel as Vagabond slid off the face of a swell. Lisa took his arm and hugged it, then put her arms around his waist and pressed her head on his shoulder. "Don't feel lonely, Jim," she said. "Don't ever feel lonely." Jim released one hand from the wheel to put his arm around her. Still facing forward, he hugged her to him. He was grinning. "Hey," he said. Looking down at her, he reeled until she raised her head to return his gaze. "I wish I could kiss you." "Why can't you?" she replied, looking at him seriously. "I thought you wanted us to be the best watch team Neil has," Jim asked. "I do," she said. "But a good helmsman should be able to steer and kiss too." Joyously Jim bent and kissed her, Vagabond almost immediately racing slightly off course, and after 15 seconds she slammed into a wave of a boom and a shudder, effectively interrupting their embrace. As Jim wrestled the wheel with both hands to get Vagabond back on course, Lisa clung to him, her head buried against his chest. "I love you, Jim," Lisa whispered. "Please love me. Please love me." Jim squeezed her against him, his heart pounding, his eyes facing forward but seeing nothing. "I do," he whispered down at her. "And I want you to make love to me," Lisa said. "Before we die, I want you to make love to me." "We're not going to die," Jim said. "Oh, yes, we are," Lisa said. "Oh, Jim, hold me, hold me. You're the only solid thing left in this world." Jim hugged her to him with his left arm and held Vagabond roughly on course with his right. "Make love to me, Jim," Lisa whispered hoarsely. "I so much want us to make love." "We will," he said. "We will. We're so alone."